Hi there. Welcome to the first set of lectures in our general psychology class this semester. I'm going to start off with a couple of short videos that just talk a bit about what psychology is, as well as some of the history of psychology and even kind of the prehistory of psychology, as it really isn't that old of a discipline compared to things like chemistry or biology or physiology. Um, First thing that I think is useful to do, we'll do this in a lot of the different units over the course of the semester, is think about different definitions to help guide our thinking about a particular topic. And the general topic of psychology is no different, that it's useful to think about what exactly we mean when we even say psychology. Now, your textbook has a definition that I think is useful, maybe not the perfect one, and I'll bring up some other ones in a moment. But your textbook author, James Cowlett, calls psychology the systematic study of behavior and experience. And there are some very important things, even within this very simple definition. Using the word systematic emphasizes that this is a rigorous science. It's not something more akin to like philosophy, like some people might think sometimes. And it notes that it's not just looking at behavior, not just looking at thoughts or feelings or experience. It's looking at kind of the whole of the human inner world, basically. One thing that I tend to find very gratifying about and interesting about psychology is that within the sciences, you might call it an import discipline and an export discipline. And those are just kind of jargony terms basically to say that psychology both takes ideas from other sciences and gives ideas to other sciences. It imports ideas and exports ideas. Um, so what I mean by this is that psychology is kind of situated in this sort of meso region of the sciences. That more hard sciences like physics, chemistry, biology, those kind of physical truths that we know about the world, about how light works and how our cells function, and the way that natural selection influences the development of different species, and the way that different salts interact with one another to change different charges. All those things sound, kind of maybe a bit dry and maybe a bit removed from our experience, but those things are how we understand how human thought and behavior actually work. We wouldn't be able to understand how our neurons work and how our brain works if we didn't understand the different salt ions that are going and flowing within our neural networks. So a lot of those things kind of make psychology possible. The other side of that, the export discipline side of it, is that the things that we learn in psychology influence other areas too. So our understanding of eyewitness testimony, for example, can influence the way people understand the law and the legal profession. Our understanding of public opinion and how attitudes change can influence the way that political scientists think. And the way that we understand things about intergroup dynamics can inform the way that sociologists think about institutions like government or courts or things like that. So psychology both takes from these harder sciences and gives to other, usually social sciences. So it's a very a naturally interdisciplinary sort of field of science, which I think makes it really exciting and relevant to pretty much everything in a lot of ways. The way that we're going to structure this class is just going by the order that your textbook presents the information. So obviously we're going to start today with just a bit of kind of the history of the discipline, not too much, but just to give you kind of an idea of where the field's been, where it might go. Next week, we'll talk about methodology, meaning, how does the scientific method apply to psychology? How is it used? How do we need to think about different study designs or statistical techniques or different types of evidence in a critical way that really makes psychology a systematic study of behavior and experiences, not just people thinking about behavior and experiences. And once we get through those kind of two, I guess, sort of foundational aspects, then we're going to start talking about specific areas of psychological science working basically from the most basic and the closest to those like hard sciences like chemistry and biology, up to more broad sort of perspectives. So I think you'll see over the course of the semester how these different topics really build on one another as we move through. So, in keeping with that, we'll start out talking about biological psychology. How do our neurons work? How does our body communicate within itself? How does our brain send signals to our feet to know when to step? How do we, experience things around us? Which naturally segs into the next topic: sensation and perception. How do we use the visual information that we get from our eyes to navigate our world? How do we think about time and experience our reality? Well, that's all based on the biological things that we'll cover in the previous chapter. It's also important to think about how our abilities and thinking and psychology change over the life course. When you're a little baby, the way that you are able to perceive and interact with the world is very different from when you become a child and an adolescent and an adult. So we'll talk about the development of our perception and cognition over the course of the lifespan. Then we'll talk about two very closely related topics: learning and then memory. Learning is very rooted in something I'm going to introduce in the next video, behaviorism, a kind of perspective that was dominant in psychology for quite a while in the 20th century, that is just basically looking at how we react to different stimuli and how we learn about the associations between things. We'll talk about something called conditioning that you've probably heard of. That is still a very useful sort of way of thinking about human behavior. And we'll learn that learning would be kind of impossible if we did not have memory of those different stimuli and associations. So we'll talk quite a bit about different types of memory, how memory functions, misperceptions about memory, of which there are very many, and kind of work our way through there. From there, we'll move on to talk about cognition. Cognition is really just a fancy word for thinking. How do we think about and understand the world? And as a social psychologist, I'll borrow some of the lessons from social psychology and judgment and decision making to kind of show you how cognition can be both very, very flexible and fast, but how that fast, flexible sort of thinking can sometimes get us into trouble, where we make judgments that are less than ideal. From there, we'll talk about intelligence. This is a field that wasn't maybe developed as purposefully as some of these other ones. Intelligence was basically a field because people wanted to figure out why people did well at school or not. It wasn't that people just wanted to study intelligence for intelligence's sake. That one has a bit of a different history than some of the others, but we'll talk about what IQ is, different ideas about intelligence, and how much of a slippery concept that still is. Speaking of slippery concepts, we'll talk about consciousness. What does it mean to be conscious? How do we have an understanding of ourselves? Is that consistent throughout our lives? And then touch a little bit on things like sleep. We'll also talk about motivation. How do we think about our biological and physiological and social and aspirational sort of goals, and how do those guide our behavior and guide our interactions with other people? The last four topics rather, we'll talk about emotions, stress, and health. How we feel about the world, how we deal with problems, and how that is all very inextricably tied with our well-being. Our emotions and stress have enormous impacts on our health. Then we'll talk about social psychology, which is an area of psychology that emphasizes the power of situations and social factors in how we think, feel, and behave. Again, that's where most of my training is. So I'll have a lot to say about social psychology, and I hope to show you how all of these things really influence our understanding of social psychology. But situations and social factors are not the only things that influence human behavior, of course. The kind of other side of an equation that we'll talk about how you figure out how people are going to behave, it's not just the situation they're in, but it's things about them. It's their internal dispositional characteristics that we might call personality. So, what a person is like, the traits that they have, how do we think about and measure those, and how do they influence people's behavior? Then finally, we'll wrap up with what I think a lot of people tends to come to mind for a lot of people when they think about psychology, what you might call abnormal psychology, or we'll call disorders in treatment. So things like depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, these abnormal sort of patterns of thought and behavior that we might have different ways that we can improve with therapies, medications, and other types of treatment. That's where we'll kind of wrap up for the semester. So we're going to touch on a lot of different things, and I hope by the end of the semester you see how intertwined all of these things are. They seem like separate topics, but they all really inform one another in a very important way. So with that breadth of the discipline in mind, I just want to go back to the definition for a moment and just emphasize that, in some ways this is a very good definition, but in others, it might be a bit incomplete. So some other textbook definitions of psychology share some things and add some things. The scientific study of behavior and the mind, it goes a bit beyond just thinking about experience. It uses the word scientific specifically, which is always a plus. Another definition might include animals, so comparative psychology, thinking about how non-human species think, feel, and behave, and how that might be the same or different than human beings. That can be important as well. Another definition that tends to get a little bit different here, used for the interpretation, prediction, and improvement of human behavior. Now, that's kind of an applied or positive sort of definition of psychology that will kind of sort of a humanistic perspective in some ways that we'll get to in later videos. Finally, the one that's maybe the most specific here, the science of mental behavior in the human mind and the professional application of such knowledge toward the greater good. This one also is a very applied definition. It's not about just learning about human beings for the sake of learning about them. It is more about using that information to improve people's lives or affect some kind of change. So these are all very valid definitions of psychology. I don't want to give you the impression that any of them are right or wrong. I think it's useful to think of the breadth of different definitions we might have and how psychology might not be the same thing to every single person that studies it or learns about it. Last thing I want to mention in this video is how psychology is an interesting discipline in the sense that it has a short past and a long history. That it is relatively young. It's only really been its own area of science or of study for about 130 years. But the things that we're interested in as psychologists are things that people have studied for millennia. It's not that, at the end of the 1800s, somebody all of a sudden said, I wonder how people make decisions, right? As long as people have been making decisions and living amongst one another and cooperating and things like that, people have been wondering about the things that psychologists wonder about. But it's only relatively recently that it's kind of become its own specific science. So you can look back all the way to ancient Greece, thinkers like Aristotle. There are writings from figures of this time that have to do with very psychological concepts. So Aristotle wrote about the nature of memory, the nature of sleep, and we still kind of have some residual ideas from some of his writing, like the blank slate or tabula rasa, that it used to be a relatively common way of thinking about human psychology and development, that we all are born into this world as blank slates that are written on by our socializations and experiences. Well, we know now that that is not really true. There's a lot about our genes and our family histories that influence the way that we develop. We're not really blank slates. And further, we all share some sort of common drives and instincts that influence our psychology. So we're not all blank slates, but science is about having these ideas, testing them eventually, and realizing when some of them are wrong, like this one. Another perhaps familiar name, another philosopher, Rene Descartes. You might recognize his quote, "I think, therefore I am." Very famous idea that's very psychological in nature, recognizing the inherent value of that kind of reflective sort of thinking. And Descartes was one of the early people that thought the mind and the body were very separate, kind of along the lines of thinking about human beings having maybe something like a soul. We know now that the mind arises out of the processes going on in the body. So as we talk about biological psychology, sensation and perception, and consciousness, this will become much clearer that without the physical structures of the brain and the body, the mind would not really exist. Descartes also thought that the pineal gland in our brain was sort of a portal through which the mind controlled the body. So, I mean, give him a break. He's thinking about this stuff in the 1600s, but things that we've kind of moved beyond as a discipline at this point. And just to give you another, I've just talked about philosophers at this point, but there are also many physicians and physiologists that were thinking about things in a psychological way much earlier than we really called it psychology. Johannes Müller, a German physiologist, wrote a book called, depending on the translation, Handbook of Human Physiology, or The Elements of Physiology, that really starts to touch on some concepts that we would call psychological. So even the roots of these kinds of questions and this way of thinking about the human mind, very richly rooted in philosophy and medicine and physiology. And in the next video, I'm going to turn to the people that we might actually start referring to as psychologists, and the people that really started the discipline off in the track that it's on now.